Let's say that you are a Christian in the late 1600s. We've got this shiny new King James Bible, and it's been made the standard favorite official, the Bible of the English language. There have been a number of predecessors, but the King James of 1611 sticks. And even the folks outside the Church of England eventually come around to really appreciating this book. So let's say you're reading that along, and grab my facsimile edition here. You come to the end of the Old Testament, Malachi, and what is next? It's the Apocrypha. Not the New Testament, the Apocrypha. You can learn more about the Apocrypha in another video that I've made here. I'll put a link in the description for you. Yes, I will. But what we're going to look at today is probably the least known book of the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanon, or the ecclesiastical books. Lots of names for this group of writings. So the very first, as you start into this section of the Bible, you get to this book called 1 Esdras, First Esdras. We're going to take a look at this little book today. First Esdras is part of a set of 4 books, technically speaking. It's a little tricky because there are different ways of naming and grouping these 4 books. And depending upon the tradition you dip into and whatnot, the nomenclature can be a bit different and confusing. So let's start with the group of 4. There are 4 books of Ezra. In the English Bible, the Protestant Bible, and the Hebrew Old Testament, we have 2, and we call them Ezra and Nehemiah. They connect, overlap, and authorship is an ongoing question in the world of scholarship as well, in terms of who put these books together and how they relate to each other. They're very similar anyway, so they go together. And then beyond the Hebrew Old Testament, there are 2 more books with the name of Ezra attached to them. And so you can number them in different ways. Ezra and Nehemiah that we normally know in the Hebrew are usually called 1 and 2. And then there's 3 and 4 Ezra, which are these other books. Or, as we have tended to do in the English-speaking world, championed by the Anglican numbering system in church, we've got Ezra and Nehemiah, and then 1st and 2nd Esdras, which is just the Latin version of the name Ezra. So sort of distancing them and saying, all right, that's from Esdras, the Latin Ezra, whatever that means. So it's just keeping the names different so people can keep them straight and not get confused. Or at least not too confused. I hope that made sense. So the 2 other Ezra books, 1st and 2nd Esdras, are interesting additions to the way that this little corner of the Old Testament is presented to us. First Esdras is kind of like the prequel to Ezra, and 2nd Esdras is sort of like a sequel. And just mostly some apocalyptic visionary stuff attributed to Ezra. Probably not actually by Ezra. But first Esdras is very interesting. It is actually, it's interesting in how boring it is, actually. A good chunk of it, most of its beginning and most of its end, is almost a verbatim repeat of the end of 2nd Chronicles and parts of the regular book of Ezra. There are a few number differences, like in terms of the number of exiles and number of groups of people, things like that, slight differences. So in that regard, First Esdras functions a bit like how 1st and 2nd Chronicles function towards 1st and 2nd Kings. It retells a lot of similar material. Some of the numbers are different, and there's a very slight difference in emphasis and writing styles. So you don't learn a lot of new information per se from First Esdras, but you get a slightly different perspective. And it's neat, at least, to see the historical continuity linking the end of 2nd Chronicles over to the beginning of Ezra. So just tying together the fall of Jerusalem all the way to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So it's kind of a positive vibe, a hopeful sort of book as you see the fall and the rise. There is, however, one section of this book that is fairly unique. And that is, if I can find my notes, this neat story about Zerubbabel and the 3 young guards. So this is largely in chapters 3 and 4. Under the Persian king, King Darius, 3 bodyguards challenge one another to impress the king with a contest. They want to determine and argue what one thing is strongest. And to him whose statement seems wisest, the Darius the king will give rich gifts and great honors of victory. So, this is I don't know, it feels like a trope. It probably is. So we got this competition set up. So the first guard delivers his argument. Gentlemen, how is wine the strongest? It leads astray the minds of all who drink it. It makes equal the mind of the king and the orphan, of the slave and the free. And he goes on for several verses about that. So that's a pretty smart answer. It's like, okay, I can see that in the Proverbs, that sort of thing. The power of wine to, change the mind of mortal man. Okay. But then the second guard, in the beginning of chapter 4, steps in and gives his argument. Gentlemen, are not men strongest who rule over land and sea and all that is in them? But the king is stronger. He is the Lord and master. So he's looking at political power. Surely an answer that will befit the king. If the king's going to be the judge of this contest, sucking up to the king there, trying to win his favor with a nice answer. The third guard, who gets a much longer answer in this book, has his answer in 2 parts. And obviously, as you can probably imagine, this is the one that's going to win. Gentlemen, is not the king great? And are not men many? And is not wine strong? Who then is their master? Or who is their lord? Is it not women? Women gave birth to the king, and to every people that rules over sea and land. And so he goes on talking about the dignity and power of women, which is kind of perhaps a surprise in that day and age, to elevate the female sex to a position of relative strength compared to men. So that's a gratifying read from something so old and ancient in this writing. But he doesn't actually end it there. Gentlemen, are not women strong? The earth is vast, and heaven is high, and the sun is swift in its course, for it makes the circuit of the heavens and returns to its place in one day. Is he not great who does these things? But truth is great, and greater than all things. The whole earth calls upon truth. So there he goes. He wins the contest. Truth is the greatest power of all. So this is subtly a kind of a nice little segue towards pointing to the Creator and God himself. I mean, we know from the Proverbs as well as other wisdom writings that from time to time, wisdom is personified as a woman and is a facet of God. And traditionally, Christianity has taken up the character of Lady Wisdom in the Old Testament wisdom literature as a prefiguring of Jesus Christ. You can see that in the hymn, O come, Emmanuel. One of the verses in there is, O come, thou wisdom from on high. So there he is. So wisdom, truth, Lady Wisdom or truth, pointing to God himself. So this bodyguard wins the contest. It turns out his name is Zerubbabel, and he turns out to be the Zerubbabel who returns to Jerusalem with favor and the riches granted by the king to rebuild the temple. So there's kind of a neat origin story for him here. It does present some chronological difficulties, however, in terms of when he returned and who sent him, and when the rebuilding of the temple took place. So that probably just relegates this story to the status of a legend, not to a non-historical legend, basically. Because, but to be fair, it's already difficult enough for some to put together a coherent chronology of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and when the different groups of exiles arrived, and who was with what group, and how close Ezra and Nehemiah were together in time, and when they went back and forth. So anyway, a lot of stuff to poke around and explore. But First Esdras is just a neat sort of combination of books that we already have, with this one unique story, which is probably not historically true, but it gives us a neat object lesson at the very least, exploring the significance of Lady Wisdom and the centrality of truth in God's religion, and the call to present that. It's actually probably, if you did a study on that discourse that Zerubbabel makes, you could probably glean some pretty valid and useful lessons for apologetics and evangelism, because in the context of this otherwise secular discussion, what is the strongest thing in reality, in existence, to come out and say, all right, truth is the strongest thing, is a phenomenal segue to talking about God and the gospel. So this book is certainly of use. As an Anglican, of course, I'm coming at this with the conviction that this book is to be read in the church. No church lectioner that I have ever seen actually includes anything from this book, mostly because there are other more useful, more edifying things to read, and because this book is almost entirely redundant, apart from that one story. But as our articles of religion say, this book is one of the ones that is useful for instruction in manners and in Christian living. So by all means, let's take a look at First Esdras sometime. At least look at chapters 3 and 4. Take out that story of the three bodyguards and their debate over the strongest thing, and check out the great discourse about truth attributed to Zerubbabel. It's a good story. It's definitely worth a read, and it's probably very preachable. So there you go. Enjoy your introduction to the book of First Esdras.